All right, so I'm here with Daniel Burke, who is a candidate for the U.S. Senate in New Jersey. And in light of everything that's been happening with the country basically on lockdown around the coronavirus, a global pandemic, um, why don't you, first of all, Daniel, just give us your brief take on what's been happening, with regards to the international situation, with regards to the domestic situation, the economic crisis that seems to be following the pandemic. What's going on, Daniel? Where are we at?
Well, I think we're at a rather dramatic point in human history as such, because if the logic of the prior system, the geopolitical system, the system of Wall Street and City of London control over the world economy, if that logic is allowed to persist, then we're in very bad condition because there's just no possibility of solving the present crisis from the standpoint of that kind of zero-sum game view of the world and of economics, as we've seen with this just rampant monetarism, money printing, and bank bailouts over the past 15 years, but of course going back many decades. We've kind of reached the end of the line, and now we've got an opportunity to change the situation. And if we don't, then I fear that we'll see very, very significant numbers of deaths all around the world and mass human suffering and a world depression. So we have to take action now, happily, optimistically, powerfully, to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Well, Daniel, tell me this. I have noticed that a number of the social media accounts, YouTube channels, Twitters associated with people that are big supporters of Donald Trump have immediately decided to just go after China. They say we need sanctions on China. We must hold China accountable. It's China's fault that coronavirus has happened. The time has come to just ratchet up hostility to China. What do you make of this? What is behind this? Why are they saying this? And I mean, it's horrifying to me because I feel like China has actually made more progress than anybody in beating this. Our scientists should be working with their scientists to figure out how we can control this on a global level. I'm just horrified that they're saying this. Why are they saying this? What's behind this sudden desire to attack China, who we should be working with?
Well, I'm just as concerned as you are. I mean, it smacks of fascism in a period of radical economic collapse. And that's often when this kind of thing happens, or it certainly creates a vulnerability for this kind of thing, because there's an operation from some people, and I'm not certainly exactly sure how it emanates, but it certainly comes primarily through Steve Bannon and then is disseminated to various other people. Um, and that is an operation to create a scapegoat of China. And they may think that they're going to force us into some kind of decoupling situation. They think, let's take advantage of the crisis and achieve our political goal of separating completely from China. But that is a totally lunatic view of the world. And it's taking us in the direction of conflict at a time of total chaos. And that is the kind of thing that risks the existence of the human species. So I think that these people are as dangerous as the fascists of World War II in what they're perpetrating right now, and we have to address it immediately. Steve Bannon, he has some really nasty background, including a connection with various top-level banking networks in Europe, who were the same networks that supported the fascists in the 1930s. And that's really what we're dealing with, is that you've got a global financial oligarchy that is fascist by nature, that seeks to reduce the world population and to control countries ever, ever tighter. And when they see a situation like this, they're doing whatever they can to take advantage of it. But I want to make a strong point here, which is that uh, Trump has a clear distinction from Bannon, for example, Sloppy Steve, right? Because he has, throughout his presidency, claimed repeatedly a good relationship with Russia and China is a good thing, And he talks about Xi Jinping as his friend. And at the Davos summit, he said that Xi Jinping and I love each other. And if you watch the coronavirus task force meetings, he's gotten into this absolutely stupid and thing of calling it the China virus, which he was heavily pressured into. You have to take a look at it from that standpoint. And he went along with it, which I think was a grave mistake. But generally, he's up there with Dr. Fauci. He's up there with Dr. Birx, and they are praising what China did, and which is completely in line, of course, with the WHO mission, which came back with Dr. Bruce Aylward and said that they've set a new standard completely in China for how to shut down pandemics like this. So I'm very concerned, as you are, but what I am really committed to is a proposal that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has presented, which is that we should have an immediate summit between the largest powers in the world, Russia, most important powers in the world, Russia, China, the United States, and India. Obviously, it would be a video summit. Other nations could be involved. There are some proposals coming out of South Korea to do a G20 summit to deal with the crisis from the standpoint of the G20. But if you don't have those 4 countries involved, then it's certain that the rift that exists between the United States and China will become, and Russia as well, will become a grave threat to world stability, even more so than it already is. And so we've got to really urgently move forward to a kind of a unity, at least in terms of being able to discuss how to have a world health system such that we could address this.
Right. I heard that President Xi has been talking about a health Silk Road, creating some kind of health Silk Road to, transmit aid to different countries. That they've stepped up. China has stepped up to help Italy. They've been sending a lot of relief and aid. They've also sent some aid to Spain. What would a health Silk Road look like?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions on that. There's a 2017 paper that was put out, which I have not yet been able to read, by the Chinese that goes through a proposal of this. But what my understanding would be, essentially, there's going to be a level of cooperation in which there are predetermined understandings about how to move medical equipment to places that need it, and how to increase the production of medical supplies, as well as research into top-level medicine and all types of new science and technology that are needed to address this in the medical field. And that this would be done essentially, I mean, the really important thing to say is, it's more important than the details, is that it's the intention of China's foreign policy. Win-win, a mutual respect, and a view of a community, a community, what's the phrase exactly? A community of shared future, I think is what it is, from Xi Jinping, which he speaks about constantly. This is the idea that nations can have disagreements, we can have competitions, we can have all kinds of, problems. But what we're not going to have is, a confrontational system like where we're going to attack each other in such a way that we're not able to provide health care for our citizens, which of course is what this fascist Pompeo is doing to Iran, implementing sanctions. Well, they have tens of thousands of cases. I believe it's at least 16,000 cases in Iran right now, and a disastrous situation in general because of the existing sanctions policy. Now they're putting more sanctions on it. It's really like a Nazi policy. And it's got to be stopped.
Indeed. And I mean, I've seen the same thing with Venezuela. Venezuela is unable to import medical supplies that they need because of the sanctions. And they're taking this moment when all different countries are facing this health crisis and just escalating sanctions on different countries. I mean, what sense does this make? This is not good for the global community. I mean, what is the drive behind this? You mentioned fascism, you mentioned Steve Bannon, but what is really the motivation here? I mean, is this about reducing the human population?
Well, I mean, you have to see that, yes, first of all, yes, in a certain way. But I mean, look back at Kissinger. For people who think that this is somehow sort of like not the issue, Kissinger, it was uncovered in the 1970s that he had implemented a policy at the State Department which was that we should make sure that third world countries are not food self-sufficient, because that would surely yield an increase in their population. And the greater the population of those third world countries became, the harder it would be to control them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so this is a long-term stench in the United States government, and it is absolutely something that emanates out of London. But there's been a long-term trend in the United States of people who have been total traitors to the purpose of our republic and have gone along with that view, Kissinger being a key example, and the Bush family in particular. People know the Bush family were eugenicists, prominent eugenicists. And in 1932, at the Natural History Museum in New York is where they held the World Eugenics Congress. And that was supported by major American families. Now, but really what we're dealing with is an idea of geopolitics, which is of the same breed as that concept, and it emanates from the same controlling axioms, which is that the world has limited resources, and the relations between man are like those in a jungle. There's only the law of the jungle, and so really the only thing that matters is who can come out on top and control as many of the resources as possible. And that's just fraudulent. First of all, it's totally barbaric and evil, but it's not true either. The nature of the universe was recognized by the founding fathers of the United States as being such that we could have cooperative relations with every other nation. If you look at John Quincy Adams, he was the one who was talking about a community of nation states long before Xi Jinping. Mm-hmm. And this is a notion that we don't have an enemy in this country or that country. Look at John Kennedy's inaugural address. No, our enemies are famine, war, and disease. And that is really I think that now is the time where we have to bring back that devotion among the people here, because we're going to have to kick out people like Pompeo.
Well, and the interesting thing about this now is that we're facing an economic slowdown. I mean, our economy can't take much of this. From what I've seen, 1 in 5 Americans has either lost a job or lost significant income due to the situation surrounding the coronavirus. Now, what kind of immediate measures could be taken in a crisis like this? I like to talk about socialism and the banks and industries being organized to serve public good and some kind of, future society. But I'm talking immediate measures. What could be immediately done? I saw that Joe Biden in the debate was attacking Bernie Sanders. He said, well, people want results, not a revolution, right? And that's kind of the taunt being put on far leftists right now, is that, what are you going to do to actually solve people's problems right now? Well, what could be done in this moment? If you were a member of the U.S. Senate, as you aspired to be, or if you were, in the White House, what would you do immediately to address the economic fallout of the corona situation?
Well, I can say, first of all, this is essentially, totally unprecedented. We may be able to compare back to situations in the past, but it's limited in that respect. However, Mr. LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche, put out a proposal, which is sort of, and essentially it's a Franklin Roosevelt response that we're going to have to implement in this situation. In 2014, he said, emergency measures to rescue the U.S. economy. And he put out something called his 4 Laws document, in which he went through what he would do if he were president immediately and what needed to be done. And here we are, and the fallout has begun on what I would say is much more than an economic slowdown. I think we're looking at a systemic meltdown, and it's not caused by the virus, but rather triggered by the virus, because we've had such a buildup of enormous worthless paper, so that we have at least $4 trillion in junk bonds just in the U.S. non-financial corporate debt. And that, like, those corporations are going to be able to pay their debt service right now. The whole thing is going to go, and it could trigger the much larger, about $1.8 quadrillion of speculative assets that are in the system. It's certainly going to. And the question is, what are we going to do about that? What Roosevelt did when he came in, when we had bank runs going on. We had a disastrous situation generally. Is that he put together a response that began with a market holiday, and that's really, or in actually he had a number of banking holidays, but what we need is a market holiday today, which means basically the stock market is just going totally wild like a roller coaster and plummeting, and what we need to do is to put it on hold. What we're saying is save the people, quarantine Wall Street. So you put the whole thing on hold, and then you come in with a policy of Glass-Steagall, where we say to the banks, you are not allowed to be both an investment bank that deals with speculative activities and a commercial bank that deals with physical assets. By physical assets, I mean things like small business loans, infrastructure loans, things that actually mortgages, student loans, things that deal with the real economy as such. We're going to take that off and put a firewall up in between the two sides of the activity, because the other side of it are these completely stupid derivatives, interest rate swaps, all of these kinds of things that are similar to what melted down before.
Yeah, Glass-Steagall is the idea. We separate speculation from regular banking, right? I mean, that's the law. And it was Clinton that kind of ultimately did away with it, right? I mean, I guess in the post-World War II years, it was gradually kind of whittled away with, but Bill Clinton finally got rid of it. Why would you not want to have a separation between speculative banking and other in the physical economy? Like, why would anyone be opposed to Glass-Steagall?
Well, the only people who oppose it are people who think that they can benefit from converting the whole economy into a financial bubble. And that's what they've been doing.
Money, essentially, right? I mean, that's
you just want to. Yeah, the point is that if you can gamble with someone, if you have what they call universal banking, where you don't have Glass-Steagall, then the banking institution can gamble with the deposits that they're holding, and they can, and then when the crash comes, then they say, well, we've got these deposits, so you're going to have to bail out the whole thing, because you got to bail out the speculative assets.
They kind of hold the rest of the economy hostage in a way. Right?
Yeah,
you have to bail out the speculators because they're tied to everyone else.
And that's what's happening right now. I mean, the Federal Reserve has to be shut down. The Federal Reserve is completely bankrupt, and what they're doing is hyperinflationary. They've got $1.5 trillion of helicopter money released last week, or announced last week, and then released over a number of days. They have $700 billion in new quantitative easing. And this is on top of the fact that going back to September, they've been releasing emergency liquidity loans into the repo markets, the interbanking markets, which were secret bailouts, because they don't report on what the terms of these loans are, and they create the loans by basically manufacturing something out of thin air on the basis of the Treasury bills. Now, what's happening is that the Treasury last week, for the first time since 1861, was failing in its effort to auction U.S. Treasuries, 30-year T-bills. And the result was that later that afternoon, the Fed announced this helicopter money, and then they managed to squeak through on that auction. But you're basically, my friend Paul Gallagher said, it's like if you can't pay your mortgage, so you put it on your credit card. We're just ballooning worthless debt, and it's going to come crashing down very rapidly. So what we need to do is get ahead of that and hive off the good stuff, the stuff that relates to the real economy, to working people. And then we're going to let all the speculative stuff, people are going to get out of it. We're going to have 2 months they're going to take 2 months to go through this process of separating the banks. And in that 2 months, then pension funds and otherwise can sell off the speculative assets, can get out of the investment assets. And that will allow them to avoid the whole process. Not entirely. It's going to cause problems, but the problems are going to be much bigger without it. This is an orderly collapse or an orderly bankruptcy procedure, so that by the end of the day, we're going to have 2 banks at JP Morgan. They're going to split up once again into two banks, and we're going to let the investment house be put through bankruptcy, and we're going to shut it down. And we're going to keep the commercial bank open. That's what Franklin Roosevelt did. Now, if we do that, then we can actually move on a national bank. What he did was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. I have a beautiful article on it from 2006 that I can share. But basically, he turned the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which had been initiated by Herbert Hoover. It was something that was a lending institution that was completely owned by the U.S. government, and Roosevelt put out about $1.2 trillion in loans from that bank, from that Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And those loans went to the New Deal projects that we all know and love, like the Triborough Bridge. It went to the Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration. And it went towards the buildup that actually allowed us to be prepared to enter World War II to defeat fascism. So,
like what the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is doing now, like loaning money, a state-controlled bank that's loaning money not to make a profit, but for strategic interests of building up the economy in the long term. That's what you're proposing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we did in this country. We did it. The Americans did it. And the way that, it needs to be relatively immediate as soon as we can, so that we can generate demand. Because the reason that this economic crisis is so severe is that as soon as, China is at 80% of where they were, right? They lost 20% of their productivity within, just because of the virus. But wait, they're not getting any orders from Europe. So you have a demand shock, and it rebounds back to China, and then it's going to rebound, and then when the U.S. really starts to hit everything, which is going to, it's happening now, then you're going to have an even more catastrophic collapse in demand. And so what people need is not Andrew Yang's $1,000, although that'll help, and we do need to defend people from the prospects of rent or food riots. We need to keep people going and give them the means to live, absolutely, but that's not sufficient, because you need to actually get credit out, long-term, low-interest credit to big projects. Things like, first of all, building a bunch of hospitals. That's the first thing we should do.
Right. Yeah, they should be building hospitals all across the country. We saw how China built that hospital in 6 days. Everyone just marveled at how quickly they built that hospital. It's an intense situation, and many people are watching Washington wondering what's going to happen. There's proposals that we'll all get $1,000 or we'll all get $2,000, but at the end of the day, right, there are underlying problems in our economy and in our society that are the issue here. Well, Daniel, I really appreciate you stepping in to give us your view on things. I hope you're able to continue with your campaign, even though, big gatherings are not permitted at this point.
Yeah.
But I know you'll be doing your best to spread the word. My best to your wife and your child. And thanks for giving us an update from New Jersey. All my best, okay?
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you, Caleb, and same to you and your wife. Take care.
Yep.